Vietnam, 1969. Deep in the jungle near the Cambodian border, a MACV-SOG team is ambushed and outgunned.
Back here! Get him back here if you can! Can you move him? Can you move him? Okay, try and bring him back here. Remember to stop the bleeding.
Radio contact goes dead, except for one chilling message. Don't pull me out. I'm going to finish this. The voice belonged to Master Sergeant Jerry Mad Dog Shriver. No official records. No confirmed body. Just stories. Stories of a man who volunteered for suicide missions, who carried enemy ears as trophies.
And one was Jerry Shriver. And the two were completely different, although they knew each other and, of course, had a high regard for each other.
And who seemed to appear and vanish at will. To the Viet Cong, he was a ghost. To his own men, a necessary nightmare. He didn't just fight in the Vietnam War, he haunted it. This is the story of the most terrifying man of the Vietnam War. Becoming Mad Dog. Before the jungle swallowed him whole, before the code name Mad Dog bled through enemy transmissions, Jerry Michael Shriver was just a small-town boy from Defuniak Springs, Florida. Born on September 24, 1941, into a country soon to be swept into World War II, Jerry grew up in the quiet shadows of Southern Pine and military legacy. His father, a career Army officer, instilled in him an iron discipline and a deep understanding of sacrifice. But even as a young boy, his family knew Jerry wasn't made of the same mold. His fire was different, restless, untamed, and volatile. By the time he enlisted in the Army, the storm in Southeast Asia was brewing. Jerry's desire to serve extended beyond mere service. He aspired to experience the intensity of combat and the extremes of military life. He volunteered for the Special Forces, the Green Berets, where he quickly earned a reputation for fearlessness. But fearlessness soon bled into something darker. He didn't just face danger, he sought it, hunted it, and thrived in it. In Vietnam, his transition into legend began with MACV-SOG, the Military Assistance Command, along with the Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. This team was no ordinary unit. It was top secret, shadowy, and operated deep behind enemy lines. The missions were brutal: assassinations, sabotage, and reconnaissance in the deadliest terrain. Jerry volunteered for the missions that no one else wanted to undertake. He led Black Ops teams into Laos and Cambodia, where they were ghosts in enemy territory, deniable, expendable, and often forgotten. Here, his transformation accelerated. He never wore regulation uniforms. Instead, he donned tiger stripe fatigues and a black beret. Dark sunglasses shielded his eyes. A belt of grenades hugged his chest. His face, often painted in war camo, looked more animal than man. To the Vietnamese, he became a phantom. Among Americans, his name began to spread. Mad Dog, a moniker whispered with both awe and unease. It wasn't a title he claimed, it was earned in blood and smoke. Psychological operations teams began leveraging his image based on rumors of his brutality, which were allowed to spread unchecked. It wasn't just war, it was theater, and Jerry had become its darkest act. The most terrifying man of the Vietnam War was now a weaponized myth. Some say he carried a deck of cards etched with death threats written in Vietnamese. Others claim he left chilling calling cards at enemy camps as symbols, scrawls, and marks designed to haunt minds more than bodies. But beneath the legend, there was still a man who increasingly detached himself from the rules of engagement and the boundaries of sanity. Jerry wasn't suicidal. He was simply unafraid. He saw the jungle not as an obstacle, but as home. His teammates noticed the shift. He laughed too hard, volunteered too quickly, and seemed to sleep less with every mission. His obsession with operational perfection intensified with each encounter with death. For Jerry, war wasn't chaos, it was clarity. Still, even the most terrifying figures start with small fractures. His superiors worried about his recklessness, his hunger for danger, but results bought him leniency. And so, mission after mission, body after body, Jerry disappeared further into his own legend. Not even fellow special forces could tell where the man ended and the myth began. And perhaps, neither could he. As the calendar flipped to 1969, whispers began to mount that Jerry was planning one last mission, a deep insertion into Cambodia, the kind of operation that didn't make it onto maps or reports. He insisted on going in. The jungle was calling, and Mad Dog never said no to the jungle. Jerry Shriver wasn't born a monster. He became one slowly, systematically, and willingly. In the Vietnam War, where morality was a blurred line and survival demanded inhuman resolve, Jerry didn't lose his soul. He offered it. Myth versus reality. In the darkest corners of the Vietnam War, where every face was either a potential enemy or a soon-to-be fallen comrade, a new kind of figure emerged as one that blurred the lines between man and myth. Jerry Shriver had long been a ghost, but as his actions spread through the war's undercurrent,
And one was Jerry Shriver, and the two were completely different, although they knew each other and, of course, had a high regard for each other.
he became something far more terrifying. A symbol, a whisper in the jungle, an entity that no one could fully understand or predict. Mad Dog was no longer just a man in the field, but he was an idea, a haunting image, a figure that terrified his enemies and unnerved even his own men. Rumors swirled faster than the helicopters above the jungles. Some said he wore a necklace made of enemy ears. Others claimed that he spoke in riddles, as though every word was a clue to an unknown mystery. One tale described him sneaking into a Viet Cong camp under the cover of darkness, not to strike, but simply to observe, watching as the soldiers around him trembled at his presence, as if the jungle itself had conspired to make him a part of it. His legendary status wasn't just due to his extraordinary ability to survive the most dangerous of operations. It was the stories that surrounded him. The men who fought alongside him spoke of his almost supernatural ability to sense danger. He could smell it, one teammate said. He'd know when we were being followed and when the enemy was right on our heels. We'd hear the crack of a twig and he'd stop, dead in his tracks, like a wolf in the night. And we'd be looking around, thinking it was just an animal. But he'd whisper, "They're here." These accounts were often dismissed as exaggerations, but there was a strange consistency to them. Across the spectrum of his missions, Jerry Shriver operated in a way that others simply couldn't replicate. His quick, intuitive grasp of enemy movements seemed almost instinctual, even borderline preternatural. He was, as much as anything, a perfect predator in a war that demanded survival above all else. However, the psychological toll of living in the shadows was beginning to erode him. Shriver's transformation from soldier to something else was a slow burn, an evolution that not even his closest allies fully understood. He grew more detached, more intense, to the point where the lines between the missions and the man seemed to blur. He wasn't simply leading operations anymore, he was becoming the operations themselves. To his superiors, Jerry Shriver's unorthodox methods became a double-edged sword. On one hand, he was an unmatched warrior, capable of extraordinary feats and dangerous missions. On the other hand, his recklessness was becoming a liability. His obsession with fear, with chaos, began to alienate him from the very men who had once followed him into battle. There were stories of his team questioning his decisions, of the unit's morale cracking under the weight of his unrelenting demands. Yet every time doubts crept in, he silenced them with results. In 1968, after one of his most successful yet harrowing missions, an operation that destroyed a significant portion of a Viet Cong arms cache near the Cambodian border, Shriver became a legend. But it wasn't just because of the mission's success. It was because of the manner in which he carried it out. Mad Dog didn't just blow up the weapons depot. He decimated it. He left the area in such a state of disarray that it looked as though a natural disaster had hit. The Viet Cong were left bewildered, unsure of how their most secure supply lines had been so easily disrupted. To them, it seemed as though the jungle itself had turned against them, with Mad Dog at its heart. The operation earned him accolades from higher command, but it also earned him a place in the nightmares of the enemy. As reports filtered through the military channels, the myth of Mad Dog Shriver solidified. No one could understand how he did what he did, how he moved through the jungle like a wraith, or how he struck without warning, leaving devastation in his wake. Even more terrifying than his accomplishments was his demeanor. There were no cheers when the mission was complete, no high fives or congratulations. Shriver didn't bask in glory, he just moved on. To him, the mission wasn't finished until the enemy was destroyed. Their fear turned into ash. As the myth grew, so did the legend of his coldness. He was no longer just a soldier, he was the embodiment of the war itself, relentless, unforgiving, and often incomprehensible. Some men feared him, Some revered him, but no one could say for certain who Jerry Shriver really was. Beyond the stories, the myths continued to spread, fueled by the paranoia of a war where survival was as much about psychological dominance as it was about firepower. What remained clear, though, was that Mad Dog wasn't just a title he wore. It was the beast he had become, one that couldn't be fully contained by the army, by the enemy, or even by his own mind. The Last Mission. By 1969, Jerry Shriver's name had become synonymous with death in the jungle. He was no longer just a soldier, but he was a force, an unstoppable entity with a singular purpose: to cause chaos and destruction wherever he went. But the war was changing, and so was Shriver. The brutality he had unleashed in the early days was starting to weigh heavily on him, both physically and mentally. His actions had left an indelible mark on the landscape, but they had also begun to leave scars on the man himself. In the spring of 1969, a final mission was set in motion, one that would test everything Shriver had become. It was an operation so secretive that even the higher ranks within the military were kept in the dark. This wasn't just any operation. This was the culmination of everything Shriver had fought for, everything he had become in the shadows of the war. His objective: to infiltrate a well-defended Viet Cong base deep in the heart of South Vietnam. The enemy had been using it to launch attacks on nearby U.S. military positions, and intelligence suggested that it was heavily fortified. Shriver's team faced the most challenging task: breaching the base's defenses and obtaining crucial intelligence that could pivot the war.
The most essential thing we had to do was secure that landing zone, not lose the landing zone.
But there was a complication. This wasn't just an enemy base. It was a symbol, a fortress built on secrecy and fear, a place where rumors told of a special unit within the Viet Cong that operated with the same ruthless efficiency that Shriver's team did. This wasn't a mission for a standard soldier. It was a mission for a ghost. For weeks, Shriver and his team prepared. They studied satellite images, listened to intelligence reports, and formulated a plan so intricate that it seemed more like a work of fiction than military strategy. The risks were astronomical. Failure meant death, and not just for Shriver, but for his entire team. But for Mad Dog, failure was never an option. It was simply not in his vocabulary. The night of the mission, the tension in the air was palpable. Shriver's men could feel it, along with the cold grip of uncertainty mixed with the adrenaline of what was to come. They had crossed into the very heart of enemy territory before, but this moment felt different. They weren't just entering the jungle, they were stepping into the belly of the beast. They had become a part of the war, and the war had become a part of them. The infiltration began under the cover of darkness. The jungle was eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. As they advanced, Shriver's men followed his every command, trusting him implicitly. But with each step deeper into the enemy's domain, the fear began to creep in. There was no turning back now. The mission was underway. As the team reached the outer defenses of the base, they encountered more resistance than they had anticipated. The enemy was well prepared, and the firefight that ensued was brutal. But Shriver wasn't concerned about the fight. He was concerned about one thing: getting in. The Viet Cong were deadly, but Shriver's mind was already 5 steps ahead. He had planned for this. He knew where to strike, when to move, and how to outsmart his enemies. The night seemed to stretch on forever, but Shriver pressed forward. He led his men through dense underbrush, navigating a path that seemed to blur the lines between reality and the madness of war. The enemy soldiers were closing in, and the sound of gunfire echoed through the jungle, mixing with the screams of the dying. But to Shriver, it was all background noise, just another part of the mission that had to be completed. As they reached the heart of the base, the truth of the mission became clear. It wasn't just about intelligence anymore. It was about survival. The Viet Cong had known they were coming. They had prepared for an attack, and they had set traps everywhere. The air was thick with tension as Mad Dog and his team prepared for their final fight and stand. But in the midst of the chaos, Shriver did what he did best. He controlled the fear. He became the chaos. He was everywhere, a blur of motion in the night, taking out the enemy one by one with deadly precision. But as dawn began to break over the horizon, something unexpected happened. Shriver's team, once so confident in their leader, began to falter. The team began to feel the effects of exhaustion, bloodshed, and the overwhelming pressure of the mission. Mad Dog had led them into the heart of enemy territory, but now they were starting to question whether they could make it out alive. The line between hero and madman had never been so thin. At that moment, in the midst of the battle, Jerry Shriver made a decision that would change everything. With his team at the edge of collapse, he knew that their survival depended on one final act, one that would define his legacy. Shriver initiated a tactical retreat, pulling his team out of the enemy's grasp with surgical precision. The mission, though far from perfect, had achieved its objective. They had gathered the intelligence they needed, but at what cost? The operation was deemed a success by the higher-ups, but Shriver knew better. The last mission had been a test, not just of his skill, but of his humanity. In the end, Mad Dog Shriver had succeeded because he had done what others could not, killed without hesitation, survived without mercy, and lived to fight another day, no matter the cost. Death was no longer just a whisper in the wind. It was a part of him, and he would carry that burden for the rest of his life. But as Shriver left the battlefield, a new war was beginning within him, one that would prove to be more brutal than any he had ever faced before. The aftermath. When the choppers lifted off that blood-soaked jungle floor, carrying Jerry Mad Dog Shriver and what remained of his team to safety, the war didn't end. It simply changed its shape. The mission had been called a success by the brass. The intelligence was secured, the base disrupted, and the casualty report, though grim, was acceptable by command standards. But for Shriver, nothing about what had happened was acceptable. Not the countless bodies left behind. Not the few haunted eyes of the men who survived. Not the gnawing realization that he had looked death in the face and it had stared back. Back at base, Shriver didn't celebrate. He didn't drink. He didn't talk. The man who had just exposed his unstoppable force of violence now seemed subdued, quieted, coiled like a rattlesnake in a too-small cage. His legendary intensity hadn't vanished, but it had shifted and turned inward. He began spending long hours alone, poring over maps, running drills in the sweltering heat, pushing his body past exhaustion. His team knew what it meant. He wasn't winding down. He was preparing for something. But what? Whispers began to circulate among special forces about rumors of Shriver's growing paranoia. Some claimed he was obsessed with the idea of a shadow force within the Viet Cong, a brutal mirror of his own team, trained specifically to neutralize rogue American operatives. Others swore he believed he was being watched not just by the enemy, but by his own command. It was said he no longer trusted orders, unless they came directly from the few superiors he respected. Trust, like everything else in the jungle, had eroded. Despite this, Shriver remained a top asset. His reputation had only grown. "This," one general muttered during a classified briefing, pointing at Shriver's dossier. "This is the most terrifying man of the Vietnam War." And perhaps he was. To the Viet Cong, Shriver was a ghost cloaked in death. To his comrades, he was a legend forged in napalm. But legends carry weight, and his was beginning to crush him. In early 1970, something changed. Shriver received a new mission, covert, high-risk, and deeply classified. The assignment wasn't just a jungle sweep or intel grab. This was an operation with no official name, no public record, and no guarantee of extraction. It would send Shriver deep into enemy-controlled Cambodia to disrupt a suspected North Vietnamese command node operating just beyond the border. The assignment was highly illegal under U.S. policy at the time, but the stakes were deemed worth the risk. Shriver didn't hesitate. He took his team and disappeared into the trees. Then nothing. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Radio silence. Initially, the higher command assumed that there was a communications failure. Then came panic. Search missions were launched, but none returned with answers. No bodies, no gear, no footprints. It was as if Shriver and his team had vanished off the face of the earth. Whispers once again echoed through the ranks. Had he been captured, killed, or defected? What followed was a maelstrom of speculation. Some believed he had been betrayed by U.S. intelligence, sent on a suicide mission to erase a problem. Others claimed Shriver had finally crossed over, gone native, or worse, gone rogue. But one theory stood above the rest, whispered with awe by veterans who had seen things they could never explain.
And Shriver was the other guy. And Shriver, he had an air about him that made you both respect and feel sorry for him.
They said Shriver had chosen to stay behind, not for revenge, not for patriotism, but because war had become his reality. The jungle was the only place he still felt alive. His legend exploded from there. Villagers reported sightings of a white phantom deep in the Cambodian mountains. North Vietnamese units spoke of a ghost with no dog tags who struck under moonless skies and vanished without a trace. Some stories said he wore enemy uniforms, others that he lived in a cave, guarded by tripwires and bones. It didn't matter what was true. The point was, Jerry Shriver had become more than a man. He had become fear incarnate. His story passed from soldier to soldier, swelling in the telling, until even new recruits knew the name Mad Dog and whispered it with a mix of dread and reverence. The narrative was no longer just a tale about survival. It was about a soldier, forged in fire, who could become more terrifying than the war that made him. And just when it seemed the myth had settled into silence, a final detail emerged from something so strange it couldn't be ignored. A coded transmission was intercepted months after the mission's failure. Short, crackling, barely intelligible. It said one thing: "I'm still here." Echoes of a ghost. Years passed, but Jerry Mad Dog Shriver never resurfaced. No funeral, no body, no resolution, just an echo that refused to die. Even decades later, deep in the dense, vine-choked forests of Southeast Asia, the legend still stalks. Locals still whisper of a spectral soldier who moves like wind and strikes like thunder. They say he protects certain villages and punishes others. The U.S. government eventually declared him missing in action, presumed dead. But those who served with him never bought that. They say the war ended, but not for him. For some, Jerry Shriver was a cautionary tale of what war does to men. For others, he was a necessary evil, a monster created to face worse monsters. But for all, he remains the most terrifying man of the Vietnam War. What stories did you hear about Mad Dog? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't hesitate to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. This way, you'll be the first to know each time we upload a new video. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.